Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you all are joining from. Well, we are super excited to talk to you about, you know, modern apps, building modern apps with .NET, Visual Studio, and Azure. With me today, my name is Nish. With me today, I have my super good friend, Vivek. Hey, Vivek, how are you doing?
Hey Nish, how are you?
Good, as
I'm doing
always.
good. I'm doing good. We usually don't meet in such forums, right? We usually meet in Samosa Chai.net show.
Exactly. Yeah. So Vivek and I, we run a popular show on .NET called Samosa.net. And if you're new to this space, we encourage you to check this out. It's a wonderful show. It talks about .NET in detail. We talk about Visual Studio tooling. We talk about Blazor. We talk about .NET MAUI. How long are we running the show, Vivek?
We are in season 3, almost like 12, 13 episodes,
Right.
and the history is obviously the same, right? It's basically you teaching me .NET. I
Yes.
started with .NET, you teaching me .NET in this particular show. So that's what we're going to do today as well. We're going to teach people how to use .NET with Visual Studio.
And Azure for sure, right? So before that, Vivek, for all the viewers out there, tell us who you are.
Hey, folks, I'm Senior Cloud Advocate at Microsoft. I'm a technophile. I enjoy working on different technologies and learning open source tools. I'm very passionate about Kubernetes, DevOps, serverless, and the most interesting thing about these platforms and these technologies are basically uh, how you can build and deploy some amazing apps to cloud. So yeah, I enjoy working on all of them. So
That's
Nish,
great.
what
So
about you?
mhm. My name is Nish. I work on the developer division at Microsoft. So everything that I'm going to talk about here in Visual Studio, Azure, and .NET, that's all my team. So I work on the community team. I do advocacy, a lot of advocacy, and also kind of like look at all the other documentation. I work on the .NET architecture guidance, which includes the some of the things that you mentioned, which is microservices, cloud native tools, and things like that. We kind of like build a guidance for senior developers and architects to kind of like go and see how you can build scalable applications in cloud. Vivek, I think today what we are going to cover is a large spectrum, and we just have 40 minutes. So we're going to like pack everything in and then show you some of the amazing things that are there on the Visual Studio tooling as well as Azure. We'll start with what .NET is, and then I'll briefly touch upon Blazor and .NET MAUI. Although I'm not going into the get started kind of samples, but I want to show you a holistic sample which connects everything together, a Blazor WASM app versus a Maui app, and also connecting to a backend like Azure Container Apps. Vivek, I know that you have a wonderful demo on how to get started with Azure Container Apps, right? And we're going to talk about that. I think we're going to talk about Kubernetes. Are we talking about Kubernetes today, Vivek?
No, how you
No.
can build, yeah, how you can use containers without Kubernetes,
Right, right, exactly. So that's the point.
without
We
the
are definitely
complexity
going
of
to use
Kubernetes,
Kubernetes. Yeah, we are definitely going
without
to
the
use
complexity.
Kubernetes without the
Yeah.
complexity. Exactly, that's what I was coming to. Wonderful, wonderful. So I think we have enough spoken about ourselves and our show that we do. We are super excited, and let's get started. All right, let's talk about .NET. What I want to tell you today is you can build anything with .NET. To put it simply, you can build on web, build for cloud, build for mobile apps, build for gaming, IoT, you name it, you have it, right? So you can build anything on .NET. Now, the latest .NET that we work on is the .NET 6, and we are also due to announce .NET 7 in the coming months. The .NET is cross-platform and it's also open source. You can use the same tools, libraries, languages, and runtime to build any application across web, mobile, desktop. As I mentioned earlier, you name the workloads, you will be able to build on using .NET. Once you learn one, you can easily pick up on the another. To enable specific app scenarios, app models or app frameworks are built on top of these base libraries and runtime to extend what .NET can do. So with .NET 6, we have unified the SDK, common base libraries, and runtime on which all these app models sit. .NET has a vast ecosystem of thousands of library packages you get via NuGet and open source projects in development on GitHub. There are also hundreds of vendors providing additional components, tools, libraries, and services. You can use a broad set of IDEs and editors with .NET, including the best-in-class tools like Visual Studio or Visual Studio for Mac, and if you are like me, the favorite cross-platform editor, which is the VS Code or Visual Studio Code. Let's talk about client development. Client development is important, mainly when more and more people use apps on different devices with various form factors. For example, some still use desktop apps, and more than 1 billion people are using Windows 10 and 11 devices worldwide, and nearly 4 billion use them on their iPhones and Androids. These numbers will increase year on year, so as developers, it is so important to focus on client development as well. So let's briefly look at the options that we have now. I will not cover the desktop apps using WPF, WinForms and such. Instead, I will touch upon the full stack web development with Blazor, which you can also extend to mobile platforms using hybrid scenarios. We will also look at that in briefly. With .NET MAUI, that is the multi-platform app UI, which will help you cover both native desktop apps and mobile app development as well. Let's start with Blazor. Blazor lets you write full stack web apps with C# instead of JavaScript, and it has become very popular. In fact, it's one of the fastest growing workloads in .NET today. It has supported two models since spring 2020, which is Blazor Server and Blazor WebAssembly. Now, Blazor WebAssembly runs completely in the browser. Blazor has a shared component model across the server and the client browser. Depending on your application needs, you can choose the right model for you. Now, we have released even more features for you in the Blazor web apps in .NET 6. Some include, like for example, you can now ahead of time compile your Blazor WebAssembly apps to WebAssembly for significantly improved runtime performance. The download size of Blazor WebAssembly apps is also smaller, even though we have added support for over 500 new APIs in .NET 6. When pre-rendering Blazor components from the server, you can now persist the state of those components so it can be reused on the client as well. And let's talk about MAUI. .NET MAUI is the most productive way to develop native apps with a single code base that performs great on any consumer device. We GA'd both .NET MAUI and the tooling support in Visual Studio. .NET MAUI is the evolution of Xamarin Forms designed to help you deliver high-performance, cross-platform, native desktop and mobile apps all from a single code base. .NET MAUI under the hood uses technologies out there today for building native apps on Windows with WinUI, Mac Catalyst for macOS, and of course iOS and Android. .NET MAUI abstracts all those frameworks into a single framework built on .NET 6. .NET MAUI on Windows supports WinUI, allowing these apps to use all the newest native features on supported versions of Windows 10 as well. That means you can build all these apps for any device from a single code base and project system. Instead of learning different stacks and languages for each, you can use one language, one set of libraries, and one UI stack for all of them. We first supported Blazor on the server, then in the browser with WebAssembly. I mean, we talked about it briefly in the previous slide. Now, we are extending it again so you can write Blazor hybrid apps. This means you can write hybrid client apps which combine web and native UI together in a single native client application. It is primarily targeted at web developers that want to provide rich client and offline experiences for their users. Now, Blazor Hybrid Apps is built on top of .NET MAUI. It relies on the UI stack for native application container and native controls should you want to use them. Blazor desktop apps have full access to the machine. You can do things like call native APIs like make a phone call using the dialer, access to the file system, write multi-threaded applications, all with the high performance and optimal memory conceptions you get with the .NET. You can't do this with pure web technologies, and that's where this comes a little better, I would say. So as you can see, you have choices when it comes to native and web development with .NET. It comes down to reach and power, and it's a sliding scale. Depending on your application needs, you can choose the right mix for you. If you are a fully web stack developer and you have a full web application that you want to take to the mobile, you can use the fully web for most reach. And if you're someone who wants the native and the richest features on the mobile, then use the native features or using .NET MAUI. So if you're someone who is in between, you want to make use of both, then yes, you can use the Blazor hybrid and let it reach all your audiences as well. All right, with that, I want to quickly turn it over to Vivek to talk about cloud development.
Thanks, Nish. I'm going to spend some time on cloud development. There are two patterns. One is monolithic architecture, the other is microservice architecture. For today's discussion, let's talk about microservices. Microservice application is built using bunch of containers running as a service. Different services solve different problems, but to manage and scale containers, we need good orchestrator, which is Kubernetes, and which is also difficult to upskill from a developer's perspective. And hence, Azure Container Apps was introduced to run microservices and container applications on a serverless platform. There are certain use cases of Azure Container Apps. One is deploying API endpoints, hosting background processing application, handling event-driven processing, running microservices, which we discussed already. The good thing about Azure Container Apps is that it can scale dynamically in different situations. That is, it could be HTTP traffic or event-driven processing, CPU or memory load, which is a very common use case for scaling, and any CADA-supported scaler as well. Container Apps also supports dappers, which is to deploy and manage microservice architecture within the Kubernetes ecosystem. The good thing about Azure Container Apps is you enjoy the benefit of running containers while you leave behind the concerns of managing cloud infrastructure and complex container orchestrators. Let us see a demo of Azure Container Apps. Let me go to all resources on my Azure portal, and you could basically see that I have a bunch of things deployed already. So one of the things which I have deployed is container registry. So container registry is already there, and I have the containers built, and I have published my container onto the Azure Container Registry. And now I'm going to deploy a Azure Container App. So let us go and create a resource and go under containers and go to Container Apps. Here you go. So all we need to do is to select subscription, resource group, name something, and select the environment. So as you can see, environment is to create around the one or more container apps which can communicate with each other. And there is obviously virtual network is there. There's logging for this whole environment and Dapper support to manage the communication and manageability of these apps. So we will learn more about container apps environment in our Reactor sessions. Let's go and deploy an app. So you can also deploy a quick image, a simple hello world container, or we can go ahead and deploy our own .NET Blazor app. I'll give it a name. We'll select Azure Container Registry. I have a registry. I have an image in that registry. I have a version in that registry, and I'm enabling ingress, which is accepting traffic, and we just get that traffic and review and create. So once you run this application, like create, once you click on create button, it creates a container app. So once it creates a container app, it's basically here. I'm going to show you, which is already created. So this is the one which I have already created. So let me open this up. you will get a URL here where your container is deployed. The API endpoint is deployed, or the container is deployed, or your complete service is deployed. And this is the service which I have deployed. You can see that this link is the same. So if I click on this link, you can see this application running. So you can do a bunch of things. One is continuous deployment, which is, basically use the GitHub Actions to build and deploy your application. You could use dappers, as we talked about, deploying and managing microservice architecture. You could do a bunch of other things like custom domain and ingress and other things which are very important from a from a orchestrator perspective. But as a developer, you don't have to worry about this. It is already been set up for you. And there is revision management as well. Basically, if you have two different versions of containers running, and you could split the traffic and do the brew clean deployments and other things which is required for you to build a world-class application. And then there is metrics and logging support as well. So this is about simple demo about Azure Container Apps. But we will go back and see end-to-end cloud native development using Azure Container Apps.
Thank you, Vivek. So as part of the demo, what we are going to look at is a complete end-to-end development of a REST API endpoint in Visual Studio and ASP.NET, and then we're deploying it to the cloud. And also, because we are writing microservices in cloud native development, you need a DevOps setup, that is a CI/CD pipeline setup. And we will also look at how Visual Studio can do that, everything automatically within the tool set that it comes with. All right, before that, let's talk about Visual Studio a little bit. Well, this is one of my favorite IDEs, and it is one of the best IDEs on the planet. And when you talk about Visual Studio, along with .NET 6, we also released the next major version of Visual Studio, and which is called the Visual Studio 2022 or VS 2022, right? So Visual Studio 2022 is the best IDE for .NET development, with support for latest project types for cross-platform, mobile, and desktop apps with .NET MAUI and things like that. Also responsive web UIs with Blazor. You can build, run, debug .NET apps in Linux environments with the WSL integration, which is Windows subsystem for Linux. And it also helps you edit running ASP.NET Framework web forms in an updated web designer using Web Live Preview as well. Some of my favorite features include, the way it helps us stay productive and collaborative with hot reload. And we'll talk about that in a bit. And then there is IntelliCode, which is a whole line completion suggestions for common code refactoring on the fly. It also has built-in Git and GitHub integration to clone repositories, manage work items and pull requests, and automatically set up CI/CD workflows to GitHub Actions in Azure, which is what I was telling you a little bit earlier. And we will also look at that in the demo as well. And one more thing, Visual Studio 2022 is the first 64-bit version of Visual Studio, so it can take advantage of the full power of your dev box to work on projects of any size and scale. So if you haven't yet updated your Visual Studio, then I would encourage you to go to visualstudio.com and then download the latest version. There's also a community edition, which is free. You can use it for your personal projects and things like that. All right, as I mentioned, one of my favorite features, which I wanted to again stress upon, is the hot reload feature, which is awesome, where you can actually edit a few things on the fly while the app is running, and you can see them live getting updated. Especially useful when you're building apps for web and mobile. I don't know if you are like me, if you use the Android emulators in the past, it takes a long time for the emulators to come up and then edit and all those things. Now that even if with the Intel Haxum emulators, things have gotten better, but hot reload makes it even awesome, which is, it is most optimized for the hot reload experience, and it helps you edit Razor pages, it helps you edit CSS, and it is really amazing. And this is something which I'm not showing you today in the demo, but I would encourage you to go check that out yourself. All right, the demo that we are going to look at today is something called as .NET Podcast. Now, if you're looking for a sample where you want to see end to end of building like an architecture where you have the .NET MAUI, you have the Blazor apps, you want to see how things are working together, you want to deploy them to cloud using Azure Container Apps that Vivek showed. So this is an end-to-end sample for you to get started. And one thing we made it clear when we were building this sample was to keep it very, very simple. So it's pretty easy to get you started onto the sample. Briefly, I'll touch upon the architecture. I would be going into the details of this when I start with the demo, but here is the overall architecture of it. For example, it has a .NET MAUI app. That means it has iOS, Android, macOS, Windows applications, as well as it has the web app, which is built on Blazor WASM. And we also have a scenario which is called the listen together mode, where two people want to listen to podcast. They can do that together, and that particular mode was actually a Blazor WASM component, and we also show how that can get integrated into the .NET MAUI like a hybrid scenario. That means you have a .NET MAUI app, but you also have a Blazor WASM component within that. So you have scenarios where sometimes before you build a native pages, you want to quickly have something which was built for the web integrate into the mobile platform. You have that scenario, which you can take a look at it. All right. The other thing is the backend for these mobile apps and the web apps is the Azure Container Apps. So we will go into the in depth of understanding how we have used these container apps. For example, auto scaling using Keda. So we will look at that in a bit. The rest of the things are like Azure Storage and Azure App Services. So it has a very mix of things, and everything has been used with a purpose. So we can take a look at the demo. All right, let's look at the demo. We'll start creating the podcast API backend in Visual Studio. Create a new project, choose ASP.NET Core Web API, provide a name, and make sure to check the Docker support in it. And then click Create, and this will give a default Web API project. And because it has Docker file in it, the Visual Studio detects that Docker was not running, so it goes ahead and starts Docker Desktop. Take a bit of time, but then it just goes and builds the images, and then now we're ready to go. The project by default gives me a weather forecast endpoint, so I'm going to change that to something like categories, which may be relevant to the podcast API. I'm going to leave the implementation as is because I'm just going to create as a sample, but I also going to create another endpoint, which is called shows, and I can just remove those weather forecast implementation there, and I'm just simply going to return a string. Probably I'm going to write return all episodes, or maybe I can just type return shows, which is great. Now I have two endpoints. I'm going to change the name as well, and I'm going to run this in Docker. When I do run, you can see that I have by default, I get the Swagger endpoint. So I have categories and shows right there. I can expand it and execute, and you can see the response has shows in it. Now let's go and publish this in Azure. So if you right click and publish, you get this menu, and you can choose Azure here. You can also choose Docker Container Registry if you're just simply creating an image. Now here I'm going to choose Azure Container Apps. You see preview, but it's now GA, but I'm going to choose that and click next. Now this one gives me to select container apps. I'm going to create a new one. I'm going to create a name. It creates an environment. It provides resource groups and other things. Make sure you select the right ones and then click create. Now this will go ahead and create the environment for me. The one more step over here is to create the registry as well, so that you want to keep it in a secure registry, the images that you create. So I'll just choose mine, which is already there, which is the niche demos. So I'll go ahead and click finish. And now you can see it already created an endpoint for me, ingress, with including HTTPS there. And that comes free for Azure Container Apps, right? I can go and choose Swagger to see, all right, there's nothing there. Now I need to publish, because that's when my image is going to be picked up by Container Apps, right? So I do that. And now let's go see what's the response. Now if I go do Swagger, I should be getting the same thing that we saw earlier. That's it. Categories and shows right there. We'll also look at how to publish this into Azure App Services as well. So this is also available in Visual Studio. So this time I choose Azure App Service on Linux, click next, and then choose the app service instance that I want to deploy to. I don't have one, so I'm going to create a new one and call this as Podcast API Test, choose a hosting plan and create. And because I'm working with APIs, Visual Studio also gives me one more step. If I want to, I can go ahead and create this API management as well, so that I can secure my APIs and provide this endpoint instead of the other endpoint created by the app services, and I can create all sort of policies to let people in, right? So I'm going to just create it with the podcast as an API URL suffix. So this is going to be, the Visual Studio is going to talk to the Azure App Services and Azure API Management and create necessary things that is required. It's all done in Visual Studio. So I click finish. It's going to go do everything that it needs to do to get things ready for us. So it's going to take a little bit of time. In this video, just a little bit fast forwarded, but it'll take a bit of time, but it's all going to work great. Now, if you look at podcast API management, which is what created there, so you see that there's a gateway URL. Now I can navigate to that URL and see if my endpoint is accessible. So it says no, access denied, because it requires a subscription key, and that's the thing that comes default. So I can go ahead and disable that for this demo. You can think of how else you want to secure these APIs. Those policies can be written, but for this demo, I'm just going to remove the subscription required checkbox from here. So if I go ahead and uncheck the subscription required, and then go down, and then there's a save option. Click on that, and this is going to, refresh the endpoint. Now, if I go back to the API endpoint with categories, and let's say refresh this, and now you will see the categories, basically the weather forecast, whatever we wrote. All right. So far, this source code is on my local, so I can go ahead and add to my source control. I'm going to choose GitHub. You can choose Azure DevOps if you want to, but I'll add in GitHub credentials here so that I can publish this repository into my GitHub. So I'm going to enter my details there and also change a few things, like let's go ahead and change the name, repository name, to podcast-API instead of dot. And I'll leave that to be a private repository for now, but you can go ahead and change it if you want to. Create and push. So this will take care of taking my source code and publishing it there. Now, if I do a publish again, it asks me for registry. That's okay because I have it. Now look at this. It has CI/CD option as well. So instead of publishing directly to Azure, I can choose this option. What it is going to do is it's going to create a CI/CD pipeline as well for me. And this is all Visual Studio doing all the amazing things that it can do, right? So now it says whatever you go change, and then if it's push, then it is going to go and deploy as well. So just to see this working, what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the endpoint, or I'm going to add the endpoint. We call this as episodes. And then simply, let's call it as episodes. Let me type it right. That's it. And then commit the changes as always. Now, if I say commit all, and then the next step is syncing. So I'll go ahead and sync this repository. So now my local and my remote is synced. So I'll go back to check. So I'll log into my GitHub, and in this case, just directly go into my repositories. Forgot the name that I gave, so I'll go to the repositories and then search for it. I think, yeah, that's podcast API test. So I'm going to click on that, and there you go. You can see that it's already running. So that means the workflow is all set up for me, and this is all done by Visual Studio. I did not even type all these things in, right? So you can go and change it if you want to. So there's also source code there. So there you go. It's built and deployed to container registry, and then it is going to pull into container apps as well. So if I refresh, there you go. So now I have the new endpoint set up. So you can see how CI/CD entire pipeline is also set up for me. Great. Just to recap, we created a new project in Visual Studio, which is a core web API project. We added Docker support into it, and then we modified a few endpoints, which are great. We ran it locally. That's all fine. That's something which you probably already know. What we did is right-click publish, and where we chose Azure Platform as a Service offerings, which were Azure Container Apps and Azure App Services for Linux. We also looked at Azure API Management. The important thing is how easy it is to set all these things from Visual Studio. You didn't have to do anything in CLI, do anything in Azure Portal, but Visual Studio took care of everything that is required. And we also looked, when we added the source code to GitHub repository, it also gave me an option to set up the CI/CD pipeline as well. So that means it just goes and creates a GitHub Actions workflow files for me. So the basic setup is done for me. So I modify the code changes, it can directly deploy into something like Azure Container Apps, which is even awesome. Now let's take a look at .NET Podcast app, which you can find on github.com/Microsoft.NET-podcast. Now this is a simple podcast app, which has a .NET MAUI front end, which connects iOS, Android, Windows, and Mac, and also has scalable backend, which includes Azure Container Apps. If you look at the architecture of .NET Podcast, it has the .NET MAUI front end, which means it has iOS, Android, macOS, and Windows application. It also has a hybrid app baked into it, which uses Blazor. That's the Listen Together one. We'll see that in a bit. Now, if you look at the backend, it has Azure App Services. Now, this is great. It has a couple of things: Podcast API, Podcast Ingestion, Podcast Worker. Well, Podcast API is just nothing but the web API endpoint, which we saw earlier. And Podcast Ingestion and Worker, they're all background services. They are running behind the scenes to particularly looking at some functionality. So in this case, let's take an example. Like if someone wants to submit a podcast, they can access the Podcast API and submit the podcast with certain information. But now all the podcast that is submitted shouldn't be going into our database. So what we do is we send it to an Azure storage account. It's into the feed queue. And there, podcast ingestion service is actually going to look at it and it is going to process them. And if it is relevant to this .NET podcast, it is going to pick that up and then send it to the SQL Server database. Now, there's also Log Analytics Workspace. That's all comes within the Azure Container Apps. We also have SignalR for doing Listen Together, which is really amazing. That is when you want to share a particular podcast with somebody else and then want to react and respond to certain things that are spoken there. We use SignalR and show you how to do that, including the Blazor WASM there. Finally, this is a great architecture to see how to build a simple podcast app. If you open this podcast app in Visual Studio, you'll see a Docker Compose file, which is a great way to run multiple applications within the containers locally. Now you can send some environment variables here, but that's all. I'm not going to get into the details of these, but let's look at how to run this, right? So if you go to Docker Compose, you can run it, but I want to show you these Docker Compose launch settings where you can choose which ones you really want to debug, and the other ones you can just simply say you do not want to debug, so that way you're only working with the services that you absolutely need to debug. Now I'll go ahead and run this all together. So it's going to boot up everything. It's going to build all the images, and there you go. So now I have the Podcast API endpoint, which is with all the feeds and other things where you can submit a new podcast, or you can also query for podcasts which is already in there in the database. I can also go to 5001, which is a Listen Together hub. It's a SignalR service. And I have 5002, which is the podcast website. And now this is a web page. And if you click sign in, now this is a Blazor app. If you go in, you can see that the ones that I've subscribed to, and I can start playing. You may not be able to listen to the music. I'm able to hear here. I can modify a few things like increasing the speed and things like that. It's accessing these APIs for running the soundtrack onto the audio channels, right? So now if I go to the Listen Together mode, this is very, very exciting for me. If you see, I can create a new room so that I can invite others to join. So here I'm going to give my name as Nish and start opening the room. So now I have the invite code or the copy code. Now I can send this to somebody else. Now, because while recording this, I don't have another person here, so I'm going to use a new private window and open the same URL. And now I'm a new person here. And if I go to the Listen Together mode, I can join the room using the code that was created there. So if you'd see, that's the code that we created. If I copy paste that and say join the room, now I can give Matt as another user here. I'm just going to show you an example. So I'm going to go side by side. You can see the dark theme and the bright theme. And if I play here, you can see on the right, that also plays. And I can also send my reaction. So for certain things that's been spoken there. So that way you can see how two apps are connected and it is able to react and respond to things. This is all the magic of SignalR. And if you are excited about doing this, something like a chat app, you can go ahead and take a look at the source code and implement something for yourself. Now, what I did not show you today is executing the .NET MAUI app, which you can also try it for yourself. If you go into that podcast app, there is a folder where you can execute the MAUI apps. You can make sure that you have MAUI workloads so that you can run this locally. You can also debug them locally or connect to the remote services. They're all going to work great. Just go to the .NET Podcast GitHub repository and it has all the instructions to get you started. What I love about this architecture is that we are using Azure Container Apps as the mobile backend. The good thing about that is it obviously supports the auto scalability feature, which is what we are going to look at it right now. And the other thing is it can scale down to zero, which means you can save some cost too. So this is all done using using Kata. So we're not going to go into the details of it, but I'm going to show you in .NET Podcast how we managed to use this feature. Remember, I told you there's a feed queue where every podcast that has been submitted goes in, and let's see how that podcast ingestion service is scaled. Now, in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the ARM template where we write the details of podcast container apps. Within the container apps configuration, we kind of like provide the details of we need an ingress, which that means we need to expose it externally. And then we have few things that we can set it up here, which is one of the things is the scalability factor, which I was talking to you about. So right now there's a min replica is 1, max replica is 5. That means based on the scalable rule that we set here, in this case HTTP scaling, that means if you have 20 concurrent requests or more, then Container Apps is going to scale your apps automatically. And the good thing is if you set min replica to 0, you can also scale down to 0 when there is absolutely no traffic as well. If you look at the ingestion service, we set the min replica to be 0 and the max replicas to be 5, which makes sense for this service. If you look at the scalability rule here, we are looking at the feed queue, which is the storage queue which I was talking about. So if we have really a lot of queues of podcasts coming in, and that's when we want to scale. So depending on the queue length, we scale to maximum of 5 replicas, and that is going to go ahead and process those new podcasts that is coming in and ingest into the database. To see this in action, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a simple script that is going to send in a lot of new podcasts into the service. So here we go. So I have something called a simulate-feed-request.ps1, and I'm hitting those URLs, which is nothing but the podcast API web point. And on the top left, you can see the message count going up to 57, 50. And on the right and left, those are the replicas. One is the web API on the top, and the bottom is the worker. And now I'm again hitting more so that, we can see the scalability. And you can see that on the top, based on the web scaling rule, there are 2 replicas now. And in the bottom, there is this worker, which is now increased to 3 replicas. Now that is so cool that it automatically is able to do that. Now, if you look at the workers, look at the handler part of it, all that it is doing here is basically this worker is going to be initiated. This is a fairly simple one. All that it is doing is looking for the .NET keyword in its title and accepting it. So based on certain configurations, we were able to scale up as and when there is demand. All right, now let's go look at the portal on how this has been configured. So see, these are the things that gets defaultly configured. And if I go into the podcast API CA, which is container apps, and if I wait for a little bit of time, you'll see the URLs and things like that come up there. So that's the URL which it's being hosting the API. Now, if I go to the Dapper, if I have to enable Dapper, I can go ahead and do that. But for this demo, I am not using Dapper, so I have disabled it. I can go into the containers or scale, for example, and see what is the configuration. So if I have to do this in Portal, I can also go ahead and do that. But I think it's better to do it in the in your ARM templates, and CI/CD takes care of everything that way, right? Cool. This is the ingress where the external traffic has been enabled or disabled. All right, Vivek. So, how do you like the demos that I prepared today?
Wow. I mean, I'm basically thinking like what all you can do with Visual Studio 2022, right? You can
Hmm.
just even I was like looking at how do you publish a container. If you have just a container, just pull it to the container apps and just publish it from the Visual Studio 2022. So
Yeah,
it's amazing.
exactly. I mean, I know people say that, do not do right click publish, but it's such a great tooling. I mean, when you are starting with cloud, you don't want to set up the entire CI/CD pipeline first itself to kind of like figure things out. So you really need that kind of tooling as a developer to kind of understand how these things work, and then we also have that option with CI/CD where you can enable CI/CD and then involve your teams as well. So it's kind of like really amazing how I feel very, very fortunate to be still a developer, doing a lot of development stuffs, and then the toolings have improved so much. It's basically that inner loop, like, getting to, as a developer, getting to build the app and getting to them to the cloud really quickly, and then kind of like scale them as necessary, and that is really, really amazing. And folks out there, I hope you enjoyed this, as Vivek enjoyed it, right, Vivek?
Definitely. And it's not just like fortunate to be a developer, it's also fortunate to be a .NET developer.
Right, exactly. Cool. I hope you enjoyed this, and thank you so much for getting to our little talk with us. And our technical handle, sorry, our Twitter handles are right there, so you feel free to reach out to us. With that, Vivek, thank you so much for joining us, and everyone else too. Take care. Bye.
Thank you, Nish. Bye bye.